Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to introduce you to a book entitled The Mentoring Church by Phil Newton. We have with us today Tim Sprankle, pastor of Leesburg Grace Brethren Church, who will give us a little insight into the book. Tim, welcome.
Thanks, Herb.
So this book, The Mentoring Church, what would you say the thesis of the book is?
The subtitle of the book actually captures it pretty well. It says it's a book about how pastors and their congregations can shape new leaders for the church. And essentially, it's working through the life of Jesus, the early church, Paul, and even some other early church leaders, and then some various church leaders throughout history up into modern day, and how the leaders, the pastors, and their congregations have shaped future leaders. And there's one line from the opening chapter that really captures the thesis well, because we're talking about mentoring, and mentoring isn't just giving content, it's giving your life as an example. And so he says, the life-on-life relationship of mentors with trainees, centered in local communities of Christ followers, remains the best way to shape a new generation of healthy Christian leaders. And so he's focusing not just on the pastor and the trainee, but that third leg of the stool is the congregation in which they do life together. And that's an important addition this book brings.
So community mentoring.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the issues that he raises in the book concerning this idea of mentoring church?
Yeah, well, he starts with the life of Jesus, and he sets that up as the model. He was not the typical rabbi. He chose his followers, and he works through how Jesus gave himself, his disciples, access to himself in not only his teaching, but the way that he interacted with people, the miracles, his kingdom vision. He gave them opportunities, he gave them feedback, he prayed for them, he ate with them, and then eventually he sent them off to do ministry. And then you can see in the following chapter, he goes through the church in Jerusalem. And Newton, the author of this book, makes a point that Acts wasn't given to us as a mentoring handbook, but there are certain principles that you can glean. So I appreciated that he did that. So he develops some principles as he read through the book of Acts. What do you see from this early church? What do you see from Peter? What do you see from Paul? And then he actually zooms in on the life of Paul and looks at all of the different people that Paul did ministry with, and pays close attention to people like Silvanus and people like even Andronicus is mentioned, and Aquila and Priscilla. And then he gives special attention to the pastoral epistles. Again, he doesn't say the pastoral epistles were written as mentoring manuals, but because they were written to individuals that Paul had mentored, you can glean a whole lot from those books. So he devotes a whole chapter to the pastoral epistles. What did he teach and model for Timothy? What did he teach and model for Titus? How was a life-on-life relationship important to them? But also, what role did the church play in that too? So he develops that third leg again. These men grew up in churches, and these men planted churches, and these men did life in churches. So how do these relationships all work in the life of a church? And then he actually, the following chapters, he kind of works through examples from history. He goes through the Reformation and uses two men from the Reformation period, John Calvin and Zwingli. He uses two men from the period of the Pietists, so he talks about Spener as one of them, and the little communities that he developed, and then a leader in the Baptist movement that I was unfamiliar with. And then he talked about Charles Spurgeon and Dietrich Bonhoeffer as more current examples of men who they started communities, and they started they led congregations that raised up leaders. They also tied into higher academia. But he makes this point throughout that training of church leaders shouldn't just be outsourced to seminaries. There has to be a partnership with the local church, because the local church is where they're going to be leading. And this is really important. Yep. So what he does then in the final 3 chapters before he gets to his conclusion, which is, here are my 5 main principles, here's some things you should think about for a manual on mentoring within the local church. He looks at, I think, 3 or 4 different models of how churches are doing this. One has a boot camp for church planting, so he talks about their church. One partners with a seminary, a Southern Baptist seminary, and then one has sort of developed their own. They can take 2 trainees at a time, and then they get them into church planting, so they have their own model. And so he gives 3 different models that could be something that we pull from today as models that we use, before the final chapter, which is, here's what we've learned from all of this. Go try it yourselves. So it's a really well-developed read.
What spurred you to read this book?
Well, I'm the pastor of a local church. It's a smaller congregation, but we are close to a seminary. So one of the joys I have is getting seminary students or Bible study majors to come into our college or to our church. They might be there for 3 years. They might be there for 8 years. And I want them to be part of our church as church members, but I also want to give them training as future pastors. And so mentoring is something for me that's really important, as far as I'm an added element to their overall training. And our church is a really healthy place for some of these young men to grow. So I thought this would be a great read to figure out how can congregation life and personal mentoring go together.
Very good. What was the, as you think about it, and it sounds like the book has a lot of insights. What would you say was the insight that you've gleaned from that would be worth highlighting?
I'll give you 2.
Okay.
The first thing that jumped out at the beginning was recognizing that when Paul's mentoring Timothy, it's not just this one-on-one relationship. Or when Jesus is mentoring Peter, it's not this one-on-one relationship. We live in an individualistic culture, and we love this idea of one-on-one, and there's only so much I can offer a person. And he developed this idea looking at the Jerusalem church. Even as you see the church explode in Acts, they're part of the Jerusalem church, and then they get sent out. And then as Timothy comes to the fore as a potential leader, it's his church that's probably making a connection with Paul, saying, we've seen something in him, and we think he'd be a good one to send out with you. And you're reading between the lines a little bit, but I've never really spent much time thinking about what role did the Jerusalem church have in shaping individual Christ followers? What role did Antioch have in shaping some of the first missionaries they sent out? And you see that Paul and Barnabas and their team are eager to come back to Antioch and say, here's what God did, and they're celebrating. And so just theologically or biblically, I sort of missed that role of what does the church do in raising up these leaders? It's not just a one-on-one or a few people pouring into their life, it's the congregation. So that's one thing, is just seeing that theme in Scripture. And the second thing is, now how can I take more advantage of connecting young men, young women who are going to be future leaders to the life of our congregation? A lot of them want to talk with me because I'm the pastor. I'm the one with the degree. I'm the one with the title. And we have so many great people at our church who have life experience that's different from my life experience, that's wisdom that's different than my wisdom, and just a certain kind of love or spiritual gifting that I don't have. And when they get to see that whole variety in the body of Christ, is really going to enrich them. It's going to teach them how to be a member of a church family versus my protege. And I found that insight to be really helpful. I want people to be invested in our church, not just in a relationship with me.
All authors of books always wish they could have another chapter, or a reader of a book always wishes or tends to wish, I wish they had covered whatever. Fill in that blank. What do you wish this author may have covered that wasn't in the book?
First of all, I liked Newton's approach. When I looked at the table of contents and I thought, I'm going to have to read about 19th and 20th century readers, I'm not interested. Like, that usually doesn't get me going. But the way that he developed the theme was really well laid out. I appreciated that. But I kept asking myself this question: not everyone's going to be a pastor. Not everyone's going to be a church planter. There are so many different kinds of leaders, and pretty much anyone in a church wants some form of mentoring. At least they want some sort of growth. Maybe it's in their vocation. How do I see my job as mission? In their family role, how can I be a better spiritual leader as a mom or dad? And this was so focused on vocational ministry leaders that other chapter on, like, what about everybody else? Because I want to mentor other people who aren't just going to go into full-time ministry. It's not for everybody.
Right.
So that chapter would have been great.
Okay, very good. And I think you're right. Sometimes we get focused on the vocational and we forget that there's other types of mentoring that are just as important. Very good. In your scheduled reading, and you do quite a bit of reading on a regular basis. Have you found any other book that is similar to this, or is there a book that might complement this book that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I'll list a few that I think go along with this, and he actually cites a ton of different authors or articles or interviews he did. So some of these would be in his bibliography of table of contents. But Robert Coleman's The Master Plan of Evangelism is a really handy read on Jesus' approach to mentoring. It sounds like it's a book on evangelism. It's really about how do you raise up disciples who are going to reach out and raise up other disciples. But that one's classic, The Master Plan of Evangelism. Another one that he referenced in this book would be A.B. Bruce's Training of the 12. So these both focus on Jesus' model in mentoring. One that he didn't mention in his bibliography that I found to be really helpful is by Neil Cole. It's called Journeys Towards Significance. And he basically takes the life of Paul in the book of Acts, he calls them the 4 missionary journeys. We know there are 3, but he looks at a 4th, and how he developed leaders and how God really changed and developed his method of mentoring and church planting. So that one's great. It's Journeys Towards Significance. And then one that I just recently read, it came out I think a year ago, was called Designed to Lead. It's by Geiger and Peck. And their thesis is that the church is a leadership development organization. Jesus created it to develop leaders. The best place in the world to develop leaders is the local church. And maybe it's an overstatement. Maybe it's actually like really good faith on what God has expected of the church. So I think that's a really good read too. And what I appreciated about that book is that they're talking about how do you develop leaders in your church who might be leaders in the business world, or leaders in their community, leaders in their families. So their description of leadership is more broad than what our author here, Newton, has talked about in his book. So those would be 4 good choices to look at.
Okay. Tim, thank you so very much for sharing some background to this book, The Mentoring Church by Phil Newton. And thank you for joining us. And I trust this book may be of interest to you. Maybe some of the things that Tim has shared concerning the contents might spur you to perhaps purchase this book and read it to help you develop church leaders in your local church. Thank you. And I trust that you will walk with the King and be a blessing.